Welcome back to Old War Stories with Uncle Jay. This one is entitled Printing in the Old Days. So, this kind of stems from a video I watched recently from Tech Tangents, where he was learning to use and to print from an Apple II computer. He had a dot matrix printer to go with that, and I don't remember exactly what model it was that he had. The most common one that was around back in the day was the Apple ImageWriter 2. We're talking about dot matrix printers. If you don't know what that is, there's this thing called Google. I'll wait. Yeah, it's got that AI now, right? Yeah. So now you know what it is. Okay. So it's the kind of thing that we used to print with. A lot of you, hopefully, remember them. I fondly do, and they were fantastic all around. But this is kind of another one of those cases where Apple didn't get it right, but people loved it anyway. Kind of like all their other stuff. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tech Tangent's video and what he experienced. First of all, the way the Apple articulated the printer was a bit weird. You had a couple ways of doing so. You could get a parallel card for the machine or a serial card for the machine. It came with neither, making you buy an accessory like a little dongle to hook up wired earphones to your phone. Yep. Because they can't put a headphone jack anymore, you know. So it's kind of the same thing. So they made you buy an accessory, but this was an actual card that you would have to install in the machine. Okay, so that was that, and once you got that squared away, you're all set. But for the most part, an IBM PC would have a parallel port of some kind, whether it was on the MDA text-only display card that had a parallel port built in, or if you got CGA, you'd get a parallel card, so you still had that. Typically on the IBM side, but not always, the printers would hook up parallel instead of serial. Now, there really is no practical difference, for the most part, that I've ever experienced with serial printers compared to parallel printers. It's just the way that Apple decided to do it. It was probably a cheaper implementation. Parallel was certainly more expensive, and it required thicker cables because you were sending an entire 8 bits at a time instead of 1 bit serially after the next. Hence, serial. Which is funny because then we got USB, Universal Serial Bus, and everything went back to serial after being parallel. And then they made it like stupid fast. I don't understand. But anyway, that's what happened. And there was no practical difference between printing with a serial printer and a parallel printer that I ever really noticed, even in what I've done on the IBM side, because that was the good side of the tracks, you know. So in Tech Tangent's video, he had an Apple II, and Apple, like I said, didn't really implement the ability to print that well into itself. There was no way directly to get a screenshot, as we call it today. In the old days, we called it a print screen. This typically only worked with text-only screens, or screens where there was really just only text on there. And it worked pretty much at any point of the machine's doing. If you had an IBM PC and a printer hooked up, and it gave you maybe a 1701 hard drive error, which I guess would have been on an XT, essentially, because the XT came with a hard drive, and you had a parallel printer, you'd make sure the printer was on and you'd power the machine up. It would give you that. There's no operating system, there's no nothing. You just hit the print screen key on the keyboard and the printer would just fire off what's on the screen. Apple, you couldn't do that. You had to get a... There were probably different ones for it. A fingerprint board, was it called, maybe? It was an additional button that you would sort of double stick tape to the outside of the Apple II, and it was like a little membrane button. When you press that, it would somehow grab what's on the screen and send it to the printer. We had one of those when I was in high school. Otherwise, you had to initiate the port on the Apple, which in AppleSoft Basic would be, it could have been PR number 1, it could have been PR number 3, and that's PR Octothorpe 1 and Octothorpe 3, which is another name of saying the pound sign or the number sign or a hashtag, which is not right. It's an Octothorpe. Anyways, you would issue that command depending on where your printer output card was. And you would press return because Apple didn't believe in enter. And if you had a basic program loaded into memory, or one that you just typed in that's now in memory, you could type list and press return, and it would send that data to the printer. Nothing would show up on the screen until you PR numbered whatever the screen was. PR number 0, maybe? PR number 6 would cause the machine to reboot because the disk controller card was in slot 6. So that was a fun Easter egg. Anyway, it was poorly implemented. So typically for printing, you would use a program, and for the Apple II, the de facto standard was the Print Shop. Might have been made by Broderbund back in the day. I'm not certain on that. It certainly was later. But the Print Shop was the one. And that is the kind of program that would allow you to create a greeting card, or a sign, or a banner, or maybe a calendar. Stuff like that. In that video, Tech Tangents printed out a sign, a Halloweenist sign. And it was just a joke in that, and then he had to put up another video after, like, people, what the fuck? This whole sign was a joke just to demonstrate it. So that was kind of fun. Anyway, that aside, it was so, the Apple was so, like, behind. Okay? Now, Tech Tangents did not have the ImageWriter 2. He had a different printer. I don't remember exactly what it was, and I didn't bother to look the specs up on it. But the resolution of that printer, and I'm going to talk about the ImageWriter 2, was it was a rebadge of the CITO 8510 dot matrix printer, or not really a rebadge, so to speak, but more of a, they use the CITO 8510 print engine, the same print head and drive mechanism and all the gearing and motors and stuff inside, I guess. And the resolution of that printer was 160 by 144. You know how you talk like 1920 by 1080? Yeah, this was 160 by 144. So instead of your full HD, it was this big. But blown up to a full page, it was just blocky and bad. And the printouts were not high quality, but that was the printer to buy. That was the Apple Image Writer 2. And if you had an Apple, you had to buy Apple. You didn't have to, but you would buy Apple because Steve Jobs said you have to buy Apple, even though you could make pretty much any other printer work with your Apple II. But the Apple II was limited in terms of the amount of memory that it had compared to an IBM PC. Even a 2E, which TechTangents wasn't even running, a 2E might have 128 kilobytes of RAM, where an IBM PC, you had at least 256 or maybe 512, or if you spent the bucks, you'd max it out to the full 640 kilobytes of memory. And then you could run pretty much anything you could think of that ran on a machine of that caliber, because you certainly had enough memory to do it. If you didn't have enough memory, it's not like today where there's swap files and Windows, because we were not quote-unquote multitasking back in those days. It just they did one task at a time, and you would wait for one task to complete before issuing the next. And that's kind of what ties into printing in the old days. So we're going to go back to that Apple. The print shop would have to... You could select on screen the graphic that you wanted, but as far as the placement of it on the page, you couldn't move it around and put it like where you want. And it didn't have to be anything fancy. It could just be a sheet of paper looking thing on the screen and a little black square that you'd move. Like, I want it kind of in the upper left of the page, or I want it in the lower right of the page, or anything like that. Or I want it, you know, smack dab in the middle, or maybe just off to one side, or something. Nope, it just, this is Apple, this is what you get, and that's it. You know, it just didn't have the oomph for it. And then you would finally get everything done, and you'd say, okay, go ahead and print. And then the computer would say, thinking. These are like Apple terms. No, actually it was a print shop term. But thinking was wrong, because computers don't do that. Basically what it was compiling all of the data together to send to the printer. And then it would go ahead and do that. But the problem was, the machine itself didn't have enough memory, enough RAM, to hold the entire print job in memory. And because the processor was so slow, or I shouldn't say so slow, it was really slow at like 1 megahertz compared to the IBM PC at 4.77 megahertz. But there's a difference, because one was an Intel chip, essentially, and the other was a MOS chip. So the way they operated were very different from each other. So we're looking at similar-ish performance, but I'll tell, the IBM just was a lot better all around. Inevitably, the print shop would figure out this data, and it would start sending it to the printer. the printer would start cranking out this sign or greeting card or whatever you chose to print, and it would start banging everything onto the page and banging everything onto the page. And sometimes printing would halt somewhere right in the middle of it, and the screen would say thinking again. And it would have to process the rest of the page, and then it would change thinking to printing, and the printer would continue to print. Now, this was true on both the Apple side and the IBM side. Remember how I said these machines were not multitasking? There also was no print spooler. That meant that when you printed something, the printer could output only at the speed it could output. And you can mathematically figure this out. I didn't take the time to do that. But you can actually figure out what the equivalent baud rate of a dot matrix printer is, to get a rough guess anyway. I didn't go and actually think about what it was for this, and I'd have to do a few calculations to figure it out, but they weren't that fast. The CITO was not fast. The IBM Pro printer, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, was a lot faster. But anyway, you had to wait. And you couldn't do anything else with the computer until this print job was done. It was only then, like if you made this whole thing and then it came out great on the printer, and you say, oh, I ought to save that because it's coming out great as it's printing out, you had to wait and hope that you didn't have a power outage, because then you'd have to create it from scratch. You should have saved it first, but you learn that lesson when the power does go out. Anyways, it was sort of the same on the IBM side, but it was a little different. You had a lot better control. Generally on the IBM side, you had, well, actually, before we get into that, for many of the school plays that we had to do when I was in elementary school, like once a year, they would bother the computer teacher to print out a banner for the play. Then you would hear it. What I mean is, it was dot matrix, so it made a lot of noise, and the computer room was all the way down at the end of the hall, so when Ms. D, as we called her, was didn't have a class in there, she would go and sit down and boot up the print shop and make a banner that said the name of the play. And sometimes it was in color. It was dot matrix color, so not great. Usually it was in black and white. It depends. And other times there were banners that were made also for other things. But the way the print shop did it is they used basically a bunch of block characters, which is just a area where a letter, you could even think on your phone, like as you text somebody, because that's all you fucking do. The area where a letter goes, you know, think of like a capital letter is bigger, but they all kind of sort of take up that sort of a little amount of, you know, the space of a letter, okay? This was older and more 8-bit, and it was bigger, but anyway, it was there, and it would just print block character, another block character, then another block character, and it would just burn up your ribbons. And it also made this sound as the heads would hit every one of these block characters as it would go across, and it was bad. And oh, forget it, when you printed a banner, it would sit there and it would go printing, thinking, printing, thinking, printing, thinking. Meanwhile, this machine could be tied up for a half hour, maybe even an hour, and you're not getting anything else done. That's just how it was. It's that simple. It's just how it was. The IBM side was a bit different. Like I said, you had full control of the printer at any time. You could hit that print screen before an operating system was loaded. This was hard coded into the fucking metal of the machine. Okay, it was just there. And if you booted up DOS, which was the operating system that won out at the time, you could press, you could turn on Echo Print, which was Control E, if I recall. That later is used in Windows with, I think, Alt to produce an elevated command prompt in Windows XP. Something. That's old stuff now. Anyway, it would give you administrative control. Anyhow, you can turn on Echo Print. It's either Control E or Control P, and then anything you would type would be echoed to the printer. So, unlike the Apple, where nothing would show on the screen, you could be at a DOS prompt and type DIR, and I hate that how they all say, people decided to say dir now. No, it never was. It was always DIR, and you're just saying dir because, like, dir, you're stupid. You can't take that and try to make it fit today. It is what it is, okay? You know, and there's certain three-letter acronyms that you left alone. Like IBM. It was pronounced IBM, not IBM. FBI is FBI, not FB. Okay? You would just leave certain acronyms as their actual letters, as it were. So it was DIR, short for directory. And it would show on the screen and it would print out. And if the printer couldn't keep up with how fast the screen was trying to print it to the screen, so to speak, then you would wait. And as the printer would print another line, you'd get another line on the screen. So it would kind of jockey back and forth in that way. The printer was always behind like that. But you could get a little gadget for that. But we're going to talk about that more in a second. I had an IBM Pro printer when I was growing up, and the IBM Pro printer was a marvel of a machine. IBM manufactured this printer themselves. You see, when the original IBM PC came out, they didn't have a printer for it. But there were other manufacturers that made printers already, like Epson and Panasonic. And they used a number of Epson printers that were rebadged IBM. But it was the same Epson printer. It was that simple. Or Panasonic made printers and you could just get one and it would just work. And there were others, plenty of others later on, but the IBM Pro printer stood out amongst the rest because all of these printers that were made by Epson and Panasonic and that generally had to be assembled by hand. So they'd get a Japanese guy, because it was Seiko Epson, and he'd sit down and he'd say, how is bolo rice? And then he would put that down and put his chopsticks down and he would build a printer. They were great. They were wonderful machines, but it required a human to put it together. The reason for that was robotics and robotic manufacturing, quite honestly, wasn't up to snuff yet. I'm serious. If you think about the early 1980s, your typical 2 liter bottle of soda, what do they all have now at the bottom? They have those like 5 little feet, if you will, on the bottom. They didn't used to be that way. The bottom of these bottles were actually round. And you'd say, well, how the hell does that work? Because it wouldn't stand up. That's correct. There was then a black plastic base for it that was made to fit just over that round part of the bottle, and it was glued in place. And all 2 liter bottles were like that. They all had that plastic base. It made them a hell of a lot more sturdy. But why? Why did they use that and then go to this new design? It wasn't as a cost saving, well, it was as a cost saving measure ultimately that they did that. But the reason why they didn't do the 5 feet on it back in the day is because blow molding injection plastic like that wasn't up to snuff. We didn't have the capability to do it yet. Yeah, there's been a lot of technological stuff that's come out in the last 40, 50 years, so it's pretty impressive when you think about it. Robotic manufacturing just wasn't there, and these printers had to be assembled by hand, but IBM said we need our own printer that we're going to make, and we're not paying people to put this together. So they designed this entire printer, and it could be assembled by robots of the day, and it was assembled by robots of the day. There is a video that I downloaded over, we're going to say about 25 years ago, if not even more, an actual video, an MOV file, downloaded 25 years ago, that shows a gentleman assembling an IBM Pro printer by hand. He had all the parts laid out, and obviously he had a lot of practice as well. The robot only needs to know it once, but he assembled it by hand just to show how there were no tools required to even put this thing together, and how simple it was, how parts would snap together and make connections by snapping together and stuff like that. It was all there. The IBM Pro printer also had a much improved print speed. It could print at, in draft mode, 200 characters per second. So at 80 characters per line, 2 lines is 160 characters, close enough to 200, but it couldn't print 2 lines in a second, because you had to, it would overshoot and then overshoot and overshoot and overshoot. In other words, the printhead would have to go past where it needed to go. It couldn't immediately stop on a dime per se. Plus you had to wait for the paper to advance. And that didn't take very much time, but still, in the realm of things, if you timed it with a very accurate stopwatch and you were quick enough, you weren't getting that, okay? But it was still a lot faster than the CITO 8510. It also could print at a resolution of 240 by 144 as opposed to 160 by 144. So much improved resolution as well. We had a program, the print shop was available, but we had a program called Printmaster that would also allow you to make signs and greeting cards and calendars and banners and all that. And there was actually another program we had called Banner Mania that let you create banners. I had a demonstration of probably both of those with an Okidata dot matrix printer that I recorded fucking I don't know how many years ago. 9, 10? More? More. Probably more. I can't remember now. I'll leave a link in the prescription where I showed what those could do, and it was pretty impressive stuff. There was no sitting and thinking. Okay? There was none of that shit. It just didn't happen. Maybe the early version of Printmaster would do a little bit of thinking before, but typically not. It may have simply been based on the fact that we were blessed with the full 640K of memory, but on the Apple II, you just didn't have that. You couldn't have that. And if you could, most programs wouldn't know what to do with it, so it's pretty useless. So there. At least on the IBM side, they made use of it. And we had the full 640K memory, but once again, still, if you had a multiple page document to print, or you were printing a banner out, you were shit out of luck as far as getting that machine to do anything else while it was printing. But the IBM Pro printer also had available, which we had, a 5 kilobyte print buffer. It was a little chip that you'd install inside, and it gave the printer 5K of memory. And that means for your typical shorter print jobs, this print buffer, if I recall, would typically hold about 3 pages worth. And this is text pages, okay? It would typically hold about 3 pages worth, 2.5 to 3 pages worth of information. So you would get control of the computer back sooner. For graphics, that meant that you also got control of the computer back before the printer was done. Now, on the IBM side, I know there were external print buffers that you could get that would go in line with the printer, and they would kind of hold the data in their own memory and send it to the printer as fast as it could accept it. But this was the kind of stuff where Jobs said no. You can't have that. No, the computer, you're printing now. You just have to wait. You know, Gates, on the other hand, changed all that with Windows. Well, sort of. Windows 3.0, certainly before that, I really didn't have the experience. But 3.0 for sure had a print spooler. Many are much more familiar with 3.1, but it was certainly around in 3.0 at least. And the print spooler would allow the machine to print while you were doing other stuff. It was a nifty thing. And nowadays, we don't think anything of it because you could send your printer 20 pages to print, and you can keep browsing the web, playing your game, or replying to emails, or watching videos, or anything like that that you do now that you just couldn't do back in the day. It was a totally different world where the entire machine would halt. I mean, you couldn't even just get a directory listing of what's on a disk while it was printing. It was just fucking locked. There was nothing you could do. The only way to get control back to the machine is to either wait for the print job to finish or to just shut the printer off and ruin most of what you printed and then reprint from that page on or something like that. that was about the only way you were getting control back. And some programs were a lot more persistent in hammering data out, and they were like, error with the printer, retrying, and it wouldn't give you control back for a while. You still had to wait, 20, 30 seconds maybe, and then if you were lucky, you would get control back. But it just reminded me, that video reminded me of printing in the old days where you were just shit out of luck. And the whole thing would just sit there. Of course, all of that's been ironed out in these days, because even on the Apple side, printing today, there's print spoolers and all that. I had read that a possible backronym for spool, for a print spooler, is simultaneous printer output online. I think it's more of a backronym than anything else, but still, it kind of fits. But yeah, I just was taken back to those days where you just had to wait. And I remember my sister and I standing there waiting for the IBM Pro printer to hammer out whatever we sent it. And you just had to wait. It's fun times. Anyway, we had better resolution, better quality. Oh, and when I think I was in the 5th grade, our school play, I don't remember what happened, but it was like the day before or something. And I said to the teacher, I said, do we have a banner with the play name? Oh, no. I forgot to tell Miss D. And I'm like, no. 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 Okay, this didn't happen like that. Every other school play always had a banner. So I said, I am going to print one out myself at home and bring that in. Would that be all right? And she said yes, and they hung it up. And when it was all over, they tried to give the banner back to me. I said, I don't want it back. Mine looked better than the rest, but whatever. Anyway, I used Banner Mania for that one. Yeah, it was just limited shit that you had back in the day. Fun times. Definitely fun times. Anyway, that's all I got for this one. It was kind of just an off-the-cuff thing that I couldn't really think of what I was trying to think about. But that's how it was. I was trying to remember it as I went. So it was a bit slower paced, but I do thank you very kindly for watching this installment of Old War Stories with Uncle Jay. This is the only one I'm telling today, so another time, maybe another place, we'll see. But there are plenty more stories. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure you click like. Make sure you click subscribe. And take care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.